Okay, so it looks like the stream has begun. It is 5 o'clock my time, so 3 o'clock Pacific time. So I think it's probably a good idea to get things started here. So I'm John Hanasak. I'm with the University of Manitoba. I was acting as a plenary chair for the public talk today. So thanks everybody for attending. Um, so our plenary speaker is Dr. Ruby Leung from PNNL, and her title of her talk is Extreme Weather Events and Their Future Changes. And Ruby is, I just read out a little bit of her bio here. She's a Battelle Fellow at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Research broadly cuts across multiple areas in modeling and analysis of climate, water cycle, and extreme events. She's chief scientist at the U.S. Department of Energy's Exascale Earth System Model, a major effort involving over 100 Earth and computational scientists and applied mathematicians develop a state-of-the-art capabilities for modeling human Earth system processes on DOE's next generation high-performance computers. So that sounds like a very exciting project indeed. And so I guess without further ado, we can have Ruby begin her talk. So I don't know how long you think the talk will be roughly, Ruby, or?
Yeah, I plan for roughly maybe like 45 minutes, and I can certainly end if I kind of drag on for too long, I will try to end around that time.
Okay, great. Okay,
Yeah,
we can,
all right. Yep.
we'll
Thank you
have,
very much, John. Yep.
maybe leave some time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Definitely, yeah. So first of all, thank you, John, for inviting me to give this public lecture, and I'm glad that I'm seeing a lot of attendees joining in. So today, as John said, the topic of my lecture is on extreme weather events and the future changes. Let me start sharing screen so that we can get started. So assuming that you can see my screen now. Okay, so again, as I said, the topic of today's lecture is extreme weather events and their future changes. So over the last few years, we keep seeing these type of figures produced by the U.S. NOAA, essentially. They kind of list these so-called billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. So every year there are quite a lot of these disasters that actually cost like billions of dollars, US dollars. And if you look at these kind of extreme events and what they are about, many of them are about thunderstorms. They could be like wintertime thunderstorms. They could be like summertime, like tornado or springtime. And they can also be like wildfires. So these extreme events are very costly. And besides being costly, they also can cause human lives and have significant impacts on society, infrastructure, as well as ecosystems. But looking at these type of plots alone, we don't know whether there have been any trends. I mean, are we just experiencing more extreme weather events in the last few years, or have there been any trends that we can actually say that extreme events have been increasing over the years? So here I'm showing you a figure coming from a United Nations report published in 2020. So this figure essentially compare the extreme events in the last 20 years between 2000 and 2019, compare that with the earlier 20 years from 1980 to 1999. So they are looking at many different types of disaster events like drought, extreme temperature, floods, storms, wildfires. These are all types of events that are very much affected by the climate. And so you can see if you compare 1980 to 1999 with 2000 to 2019, so you can see these bubbles all get bigger, right? So suggesting that these extreme events, especially like floods and storms and wildfires and heat waves, have really been increasing globally. And this one is not just for the United States, these are the global statistics. And as a result of these increasing extreme events, there are also increases in terms of like the reported disasters, the total number of deaths, total number of people affected, etc., etc. So extreme events are indeed something that we need to worry about, right? So because of these increases in the extreme events, the American Meteorological Society, similar to the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society, they publish a bulletin every month. In 2017, in their bulletin, they said that we are experiencing new weather because we have made a new climate. So an important question that we wanted to answer is, how is the new weather connected to the new climate? So by new climate, what we mean is really that climate has been warming up. So, but how would warming up of the climate be creating new weather? So this is what I'm going to spend the next few minutes to discuss. I would argue that humidity is really important, and it really helps connects the new weather with the new climate. How is that so? Number one, humidity increases with temperature. So as the globe or the earth gets warmer and warmer, the humidity also increases. Similar to like if you go to the tropical area where the temperature is higher, there's a lot more humidity compared to if you are in Canada or in the higher latitude where the temperature is colder, you do not get as much humidity, right? So this is what we call the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, which is showing you the water holding or the moisture holding capacity in the atmosphere as a function of the temperature. An important fact about this relationship is that it's nonlinear, meaning that if you are talking about, let's say, 1 degree of warming, if the 1 degree of warming happens at a higher temperature, then the increase in the water vapor in the atmosphere will be a lot larger compared to the same 1 degree of warming if it happens at a colder temperature, and you would get only this small change in the water vapor amount. So humidity increases as the temperature gets warmer. Why is it important? I think there are at least two things that are important. Number one, we always worry about global warming because we know that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide is causing warming of the climate. But humidity itself is actually also a greenhouse gas. So it has the same effects like carbon dioxide. So as the earth keeps warming up, there would be more moisture in the atmosphere, and the moisture itself is acting like a greenhouse gas. So the humidity actually amplifies the warming by a factor of about 1.5 to 2. So humidity, again, is important because it actually amplifies the warming. And secondly, humidity is important because as the humidity in the air increases, humidity, actually the moisture itself carries a form of energy called latent heat. And this form of energy is actually what drives the winds and the circulation and the convection and the extreme weather events. So I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more. So I would argue that when we talk about global warming, we always talk about temperature, right? The surface air temperature is increasing. And so that's what we say global warming. But there is another quantity. If we really wanted to look at the total amount of energy in the Earth system, the temperature itself is only one form of energy, which we call thermal energy. Another form of energy is what I just said in my previous slide, is that humidity itself is also a form of energy, which is called latent energy. So we need to worry about the total amount of energy, which is the sum of the thermal energy and the latent energy. And so how would greenhouse gases, for example, be affecting the total amount of energy in the Earth system and therefore affect weather events is an important question that we need to address. So here we need to look at a quantity which is called the surface equivalent potential temperature. So this quantity is important because it does add up both the two kinds of energy, the thermal energy and the latent energy. If you consider, let's say, the tropical ocean, the temperature is about 300 degree Kelvin, which is about like 27 degrees Celsius. For this kind of temperature, then there is a certain amount of humidity in the air. And so this quantity itself is equivalent to about 50 degree Kelvin. So it means that the latent energy is roughly about 17% of the thermal energy. So as temperature gets warmer and warmer, this latent energy also keep increasing. So now let's take a look a little bit further. Assuming that there's no change in relative humidity under global warming, which is generally the case, we know that then for 1 degree of warming in the temperature, then this humidity Q will increase by roughly 6%. And this is based on the nonlinear Clausius-Clapeyron relationship that I showed you in the previous slide. And so if we plug these numbers in, then we know that for a 1 degree warming in the temperature, this quantity is equivalent to 3 degrees of warming in terms of latent energy. So it means that a 1 degree of warming in the temperature becomes 4 degrees of warming if we look at the total amount of energy in our system. So this is really a big deal. It means that even though we cannot feel or cannot see the latent energy, but the latent energy is actually increasing very fast with temperature. So let's take a look at like how the air temperature average over the whole globe has been increasing over time. So this figure here shows from 1980 to about 2020, the surface air temperature has been increasing based on different data sets. Similarly, we see that if we look at this quantity, which I introduced in my last slide, which is the sum of the thermal energy and the latent energy. If we look at this theta E, instead of the thermal energy itself, the Earth has actually warmed up much more compared to just the thermal energy. And we can actually see that this kind of increase, about roughly half of it is due to the increasing temperature, and the other half of it is due to the increase in the humidity in the atmosphere. So it's also interesting to let's take a look at the global pattern of temperature change and this total amount of energy change. If we look at just the temperature over the last 40 years or so, temperature has been increasing. So almost everywhere we are seeing like yellowish to reddish color, meaning that the temperature has been increasing. And we know that the Arctic area is warming up more than the tropical area. This is what we call Arctic amplification. But if we look at this quantity, which includes both the thermal energy and the latent energy, actually the Earth has warmed up, first of all, much more because now you are seeing most area is much redder compared to this one, right? And also you do not see this Arctic amplification very much anymore because the tropics, even though the temperature hasn't increased as much as the Arctic, there's a lot more latent energy because there's a lot more moisture over there. So it's much more uniform spatially compared to looking at just temperature alone. So now let's take a look at projections into the future. How would the temperature change compared to how would this theta E be changing? So under different scenarios of the future where we assume how people would be using energy, the anthropogenic effects and things like that, so most climate models project that in the future, by the end of the century, this century, the global mean surface air temperature will be increasing by roughly 4 degrees Celsius. But if we look at the total amount of energy, which is represented by theta E, this increase is almost like 12 degrees Celsius compared to only 4 degrees Celsius. And also, if you look at the curve, the temperature increase is kind of like linear, but the theta E increase is much more nonlinear. And this is because, as I said before, humidity increases with temperature in a nonlinear way. So when we look at the end of the century compared to the last century, if we look at temperature alone, there would be increases in the air temperature with the Arctic amplified warming. But if we look at theta E, there is actually both a tropical amplification as well as an Arctic amplification. And these numbers are much higher compared to if you only look at temperature alone. So here, what I'm saying is that because of the humidity, the Earth is actually getting a lot more energetic compared to if you only look at the temperature alone. So how does theta E and temperature relate to extreme events? So here I'd like to show you the correlation between temperature and theta E with convection, because we know that a lot of extreme events are related to convection. The convections are like when you have heat and moisture, then the air kind of rise, and then it produces a lot of thunderstorms and things like that. So we use a quantity called convective available potential energy, CAPE, which represent the kind of energy that is needed in order for convection or storms to develop. So if we look at the correlation between temperature and, if we look at the correlation between temperature and CAPE, you find that over the ocean, you get positive correlation, meaning that the warmer the temperature, you get more CAPE and therefore more energy to support convection. But actually over land, interestingly, in fact, this is mostly a negative correlation, meaning that increasing temperature doesn't necessarily actually increase the amount of energy available for convective storms to develop. But if you do the same kind of correlation instead using the equivalent potential temperature, you see positive correlation almost everywhere, meaning that this quantity, theta E, is much more important in explaining the kind of energy that is needed for convective storms to develop. So by the end of this century, we expect roughly like a 16 degree Celsius increase in this quantity, theta E. And therefore, looking at the correlation between these two quantities, we can say that by the end of the century, this kind of convective available potential energy will increase by about 30%, meaning that there will be a lot more convective storms going on by the end of the century. So this is only one kind of extreme weather events that are related to convective storms. We can also look at extreme precipitation, right? We always worry about extreme precipitation. So here again, we are looking at the relationship between surface air temperature with what we call annual maximum precipitation, which is the maximum precipitation amount during the year. And we find that there is some relationship between the annual maximum precipitation with temperature, but actually as temperature gets higher and higher, in fact, annual maximum precipitation does not necessarily increase. On the other hand, if you try to look at the relationship between the annual maximum precipitation with theta E, it actually increases almost linearly with a very high correlation of 0.98, meaning that theta E is a much better quantity to use if you wanted to predict how annual maximum precipitation is going to change in the future. So again, by the end of the century, if we look at a 12-degree increase in the global mean theta E, this suggests an increase of about 60% in the annual maximum precipitation. Lastly, we can also, again, do this kind of correlation, but here I'm looking at wet bulb globe temperature, which is a particular kind of temperature that is needed in order to look at the human discomfort. So when workers work outside, let's say doing road work, repairing roads and things like that, this is the quantity that is most important to explain whether the workers will be feeling uncomfortable and what's the maximum temperature, wet bulb globe temperature that would actually potentially cause mortality. So here, again, if we look at this wet bulb globe temperature against surface air temperature, we see some relationship, but this relationship is again much better if we look at it from the angle of the theta E. So by the end of the century, when we look at extreme wet bulb globe temperature that is higher than 35 degree, this number is really important because beyond this number, this is really when human could potentially be really not adapting to this kind of condition. So we see that the wet bulb globe temperature higher than 35 degree will increase by 14-fold in India and southern China. If we are looking at North America and Europe, this number or the frequency would actually increase by 22-fold. So again, suggesting that because of the increase in the temperature and the associated moisture, we would be expecting this human discomfort related to wet bulb globe temperature to be increasing in the future. So this is my first part of the presentation, where we generally look at why we expect extreme weather events to be increasing in the future under global warming, and that this quantity, where we look at the total amount of energy from the thermal energy and the latent energy, is a much more important quantity to look at when we look into the future. So now I would go into giving you a few examples of how extreme events may be changing, particularly regionally, right? So previously, when I look at this, I was looking at it more from a general perspective and also from a global perspective. But we know that regional changes are not the same. So some regions may experience more changes in extreme events, while other regions may not. And so it's important for us to really look at regional changes. So for this, I'm going to give you a few examples of studies that we have performed in the last few years, looking at how heat waves may be changing in Western North America, and then also looking at how coastal hurricane making landfall in the coastal region might be changing in the future. And then we also look at cold season storms, like in the Western United States, we have a lot of cold season storms related to, let's say, atmospheric rivers, and how are these storms changing in the future? And then my fourth example, we'll look at wildfires. We performed a study recently looking at how Canadian wildfires can worsen air quality in the eastern United States. And then lastly, I will again go back to the convective storms. This particular type of convective storms called mesoscale convective systems are the largest type of thunderstorms on Earth. And we wanted to see how they might be changing in the future. So with that, I'm going to start my first example, looking at heat waves. So why do we expect heat waves to be changing under global warming? A very simple explanation is to look at the probability distribution of temperature. Usually temperature kind of distribute in a way following what we call a Gaussian curve or a bell-shaped curve. So with most temperature happening kind of near the center, right? But sometimes you can get much higher temperature or much lower temperature. So under global warming, we expect this curve to shift because there would be a general warming. And so this curve would shift to the right, meaning that if we are interested to look at extreme temperature, so the probability of extreme temperature will increase simply because the curve will shift to the right because of global warming. But more importantly, these curves might change in other ways. For example, under global warming, we might expect not just a shift in the curve, but that the curve could be pulled apart like further in terms of both the cold and the warm extreme. And this, what we mean is that the variability of the temperature will become higher. So you might have days when it's much warmer, you might have even days with that might be much colder. And so because of this, if you look at the higher tail, you would expect also that the temperature, extreme temperature would be increasing. Another way to look at this is that the bell shape could also change in a different way so that the skewness of of the curve could change. Like it may not change symmetrically. Like for example, it might shift to the right on the cold side, but it also can shift much further to the right in the warm side. And so these could also potentially cause really, really big extreme temperature. So what we know is that the increase in the variability by pulling the curve on both ends, as well as the increase in the skewness by moving it more to the right, especially pulling the tail to the right. These are the type of changes that we would expect record shattering heat extremes. So we are not interested in only just heat extremes, but record shattering heat extremes are really heat extremes that rarely happen in the past and how they might be changing in the future. So the question then becomes why the variance or the skewness might be changing in the future. So we know that these could change because of several different reasons. Number one, the atmospheric circulation or the winds might be changing. Like we know that the atmosphere has these jet stream. So the jet streams are really important governing the kind of storms and things like that. So jet streams and also stationary wave blocking event in the atmosphere can cause this kind of changing skewness. Other processes might be related to the cryosphere, like this changing sea ice can change the surface heat flux, and it can also cause changing of the skewness of the temperature. And then lastly, land surface processes, like if you have more drought in the future, this drier soil could also potentially cause the bell shape to be pulled more towards the right, causing an increase in the skewness. So now I'm going to focus a little bit more on the changes in the atmospheric circulation. particularly using the example of the heat wave that we experienced back in 2021 between June 25th to July 3rd. So during those 2 weeks, there was a really, really big heat waves over the Pacific Northwest, not only over the United States, but also over Canada, right? So we experienced really unprecedented hot temperature. So this is what we call heat dome. So because of the heat dome, this is related to a high pressure system sitting over the area. It doesn't budge. It just sit there for like 2 weeks or something like that. And so the clear sky, because of the high pressure system, allow the sunlight to keep coming through and so cause the temperature to really exceed what we normally would experience in the region. So our question is, could this kind of situation where you have a heat dome or a high pressure system sitting over there for a while without moving, could this happen more in the future? So using climate models, we look into the changes in the winds. And here we see climate models project a dipole kind of pattern, changes in the winds like increase over here and decrease over here. So these kind of dipole patterns suggest that there is actually an increasing high pressure system sitting over here in Western North America would be increasing in the future. And this kind of changes in the winds are highly correlated with the increase in the temperature. So suggesting that in the future, we could potentially experience more and more of this type of heat dome sitting over Western North America. And indeed, when we look at the historical trend and the climate model projection into the future, we are already seeing some historical trend in having this kind of dipole wind pattern or the high pressure system sitting there. And projecting into the future, we see continued increase in the frequency of this kind of events happening. And being scientists, we always ask, but why? Why would the system be changing in this way? So we use some kind of models called stationary wave model to identify like where do we perturb the system in order to produce this kind of changes. And we find that it's actually mostly because under global warming, we expect the sea surface temperature to be increasing a lot more over the tropical Eastern Pacific. So the increase in the warming over here can induce changes in the circulation and cause this kind of heat dome to be sitting over Western North America to be more frequent in the future. So now I go into my second example, looking at how coastal hurricane risk may be changing, especially along the east coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast of the United States. So for this, we developed some kind of model which we call synthetic tropical cyclones model. The challenge of looking at how often hurricanes make landfall is that they don't make landfall very often, even though they form quite often over the ocean. But the chance of them making landfall is pretty low. So it's really difficult to look at the historical trend to see, has there been any trend for hurricanes to be making more landfall, or how it will be changing in the future. So in order to look at this, we use a synthetic tropical cyclones model where we can actually simulate many, many hurricanes and look at the probability of them making landfall. Excuse me. So using this kind of model, then we drive the model using global climate simulations. And then we see that in the future, the probability of hurricanes making landfall will increase over the Gulf Coast and also over the lower eastern United States, the coastal area. And what we find is that these changes are mainly related to changes in the winds because hurricanes are steered by the winds. So what we see is that in the future, the wind changes would be in a way that it would be steering the hurricane if they form over the North Atlantic, they would be more steered towards the eastern United States. And if they form over the tropical area or over the Gulf of Mexico, they would be steered more towards the United States as well. So now the question becomes why the winds would be changing this way. So again, playing the detective job, we use a wave model to look at what changes in the system can cause the winds to change this way. what we find again in this example is that these warmer sea surface temperature over the tropical Eastern Pacific can also induce changes in the winds along this Eastern United States and the Gulf Coast area to steer more hurricanes towards the United States. So summarizing this, we see again, like the warmer sea surface temperature over the tropical Eastern Pacific can induce more convection. So the convection can produce heating, and the heating can induce waves, and the waves can change these kind of steering winds to cause more hurricanes to make landfall over the United States. So now I go to my third example where I look at like cold season storms, how they may be changing. Will they be getting bigger, getting smaller, producing more precipitation or less precipitation? So for this, we look at a climate simulations for many, many years for the present day, which is from 1981 to 2010, and then also look at the mid-century between 2041 to 2070. And so we track all of these big storms that produce precipitation, each one as an object. And then we calculate several different metrics. The first one is we look at the total amount of precipitation produced by the storms, which we call P total. We also look at the size, like the area covered by the precipitation of the storm, which is A. And then we also look at the average intensity or the average precipitation over this whole area, which is simply the total amount of precipitation divided by the area. But we are also interested in what's the peak amount of precipitation, which usually happen at the center of the storm. So this is what we call this, the storm center precipitation. As I said, most of the time, the heaviest precipitation within a thunderstorm actually happen near the center. So if we look at this peak precipitation amount compared to the area average precipitation amount, using this ratio over here, this is what we call the spatial concentration factor. So this ratio is usually less than 1 because the average amount of precipitation over the whole area usually is smaller than the peak amount of precipitation near the center. So our question is, how would precipitation be changing in the future? How would the size of the storm, the area, be changing in the future? We also wanted to know how would this factor, which is like how concentrated the precipitation would be within the storm, how would they be changing in the future? So after looking at all of these precipitation objects in our model simulation, first of all, we divide the Western United States into 3 different regions, the Pacific Northwest, the Southwestern United States, and also California. So what we see is quite interesting that in California, everything is particularly special. So for example, in terms of the total amount of precipitation, precipitation in California is always higher than precipitation in the other 2 regions. If you look at the size of the storm, California storms also tends to be larger compared to the size of the storm in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwestern United States. In terms of the peak precipitation amount within the storm, also higher. But in terms of the spatial concentration factor is how concentrated the precipitation is within the storm. It's also smaller, meaning that even though in California the storms may be bigger, but the heaviest precipitation is actually concentrated more towards the center of the storm. So now, as I said, the question is, how would these various quantities be changing in the future? So we look at the climate simulations, and then we are more interested in storms that produce very heavy precipitation, these so-called top 20 percentile precipitation. So we see that for these thunderstorms, the total amount of precipitation will be increasing in the future by about 31% towards the middle and the end of the century. And then in terms of the size, which is shown by the red curve, the size also get bigger. So the size increased by about 22%. And then in terms of the peak amount of precipitation at the center of the storm, it also increases. Also, interestingly, we find that in the future, this spatial concentration factor, which is shown by the green line over here, will be decreasing. As you recall, the smaller this number, it means that the precipitation is concentrated more towards the center. So basically, the picture that we that is painted by the climate model is that if you take a look at thunderstorm in the present day, you have these size, and then you have precipitation and the concentrated precipitation near the center. In the future, what we expect is that the total amount of precipitation will increase. The size of the storm will also increase, but how concentrated is the precipitation towards the center will also increase. The precipitation will be more concentrated towards the center, which is what we call sharpening of the cold season storms. So there are lots of implications for building infrastructure in the future, like bridges and nuclear power plants or things like that, because we worry about how storms may be changing. So the key point is that failure to account for the climate change can significantly underestimate the flood risk, because if you assume that storms will not change, but in fact they will be giving you more precipitation, they will be larger, that is a problem in building the infrastructure following what we know storms were like in the past. Secondly, if we don't know about the storm sharpening, we would not know that actually in the future, the heavy amount of precipitation would be more concentrated in a smaller area, which is problematic if we particularly look at flash flooding, which is usually caused by very concentrated precipitation in local areas. So these are the two aspects that we need to worry about in the future. Now, two more examples, and I think I might be able to finish my talk within 45 minutes. So the next example, I wanted to look at wildfires and how they may be changing and changing the air quality. So for this one, we use a climate model, and then we project how wildfires, especially the area coverage for the wildfires, may be changing in the future. So on the upper left-hand side, I'm showing you the extent or the area of burn area simulated for the present day between 2001 and 2010. And then in the bottom here, I'm showing you the area covered by the wildfires in the future, kind of like mid-century. So you can obviously see that a lot more wildfires area will be projected into the future, especially significant. The increase would be over the boreal forest in the Canadian prairie area. And so if we look at the change, which is this minus this, then we see very clearly the change. Most of the increase would be over Canada and some increases over the Western United States, but over the Southeastern United States, there would actually be decreasing wildfires because the model project increases in precipitation over there. In the Eastern United States or the Northeastern United States, we don't see any change in the fire burn area. And we also notice that these changes are mostly happening during summertime. So if we only look at the changes in the summer months, June, July, August, you see almost the same pattern. So most of these changes are happening in summer. So now the question is, with these changes in the burn area, how would air quality be changing in the future? So here we look at these so-called wildfire-induced particulate matter with a size of 2.5 micrometer. These are the kind of smokes that are produced by wildfires, and they are very tiny. The diameter of these small little particles is only 2.5 micrometer. So that's why we call them particulate matter at 2.5 micrometer diameter, PM 2.5. So here we look at the model projected PM 2.5 for the present day and then for the future. Because of the increase in the burn area, we expect increase in the PM 2.5 as well. And so there are increases in various regions. So if we look at the probability density function as a function of like the amount of these PM 2.5, so the blue is for the present day and the red is for the future. Looking at the Canadian region, which is shown over here, we see significant increase. Looking at Western United States, which is this area, we also see some increases, not too significant. But then over the Eastern United States, we also see a very significant increase in the PM 2.5 produced by wildfires. But as you recall, the changes in the burn area in the Eastern United States is actually decrease in the Southeastern United States and not much change in the Northeastern United States. But why are we expecting, or the models projecting a lot of these increase in the smokes in the Eastern United States? So I will give you some explanation. But first of all, besides looking at the amount of PM 2.5 produced by the fires, it's also important to look at the contribution of the PM 2.5 coming from wildfires, the ratio to the total amount of PM 2.5, because some PM 2.5, they are not coming from wildfires, because of air pollution, because of the way we use energy, driving cars, all of these can also produce PM 2.5. So what we see in the future is that there is a significant increase in this contribution of wildfires compared to the total. And this is partly because there is a significant increase in the PM 2.5 produced by wildfires, but also at the same time, in the future, we project that there will be more regulation to reduce the amount of PM 2.5 coming from human activities, such as like driving cars and using fossil fuel energy. So both of them contribute to the significant increase in the contribution of wildfire PM 2.5 compared to the total amount. So why this is happening? So what we see if we look at changes in the winds, so we know that there is a westerly jet, a lot of strong winds blowing from the west to the east. And what we see is that in the future, the winds would be increasing, partly because of global warming, but partly also because the increase in the wildfire itself will cause the winds to increase and therefore causing more smokes to be blown from the Canadian wildfires towards the eastern United States. And so the main point of this study is that the projected increases in the boreal forest wildfires in the northern part of the of the continent may actually challenge the regulatory curtailment, even if we regulate how much anthropogenic emissions would there be in the future. This increase in the wildfires of the emission will overwhelm our human efforts to regulate the amount of PM 2.5 emitted into the future. So with that, I'm now going to my last example. We're looking at like these really, really big thunderstorms called mesoscale convective systems to see how they might be changing in the future. So there are these big convective thunderstorms. One example is what we call the Rachel. So the Rachel are these really big storms, convective storms. They usually sweep across the country from the central United States or the Midwestern United States, sweep all the way across to the eastern United States. And because the winds are so strong, they often can cause a lot of damages to infrastructure such as these like power poles and things like that. So now with climate models being able to run at very high resolution, so this is a simulation run at 3 kilometer resolution, we were actually able to reproduce this kind of convective storms sweeping across the United States, producing very strong winds and etc. So with that, then we kind of project how they might be changing in the future. So surprisingly, we might thought that, well, with the more energy and things like that, the storms will definitely become stronger and sweep across and affecting larger area. But what we found from our model simulation is actually just the opposite. We find that in the future, the swath of these derecho will actually becomes narrower, and also it would die actually earlier and not be sweeping all the way to the eastern United States. And the reason for this is partly because there's also projected near surface warming, which we call aridity over land, which actually can cause changes in the convective storms, not just because there is more moisture in the atmosphere, but near the surface, there is actually drying because of the warmer temperature that can have this kind of impacts on the storms. And then when we look at thunderstorm more in general, we also see that thunderstorms in the future compared to the present day will tend to shift more towards the coastal region. Like there is a southwards and eastward shift of these big thunderstorms, as well as smaller isolated thunderstorms also tend to be more happening near the coastal region compared to the present day. So now just one final example. We are concerned about convective storms for many different reasons. One reason is that over the Amazon basin, a lot of trees are killed by these kind of big convective thunderstorms because the winds are so strong when they sweep across the Amazon basin, they can uproot the tree and actually cause tree mortality. So tree mortality is important because when the tree die, it actually releases the carbon that it stores, meaning that potentially if convective storms become stronger and stronger in the future, maybe there would be more trees that would be uprooted by the storms and causing more carbon to be released by the trees, and that can cause even more warming because the released carbon can cause more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we are able to simulate a specific storm, the actual score line that sweep across the Amazon basin. We simulate it and compare to the observation. It compares really, really well. This is a very high resolution simulation, again at 3 kilometer resolution. Looking at how this kind of storm may be changing in the future, we see the red line is the projection for the future, looking at the average wind speed, comparing the future in red and then the blue in the present day, compared to some coarse resolution observation in blue dashed line. Because of the coarse resolution, even reanalysis cannot capture this kind of thunderstorm, how strong the winds are. But at 3 kilometers, we were able to simulate much better the strong winds associated with the storm. But when we look at the average wind speed, it will be increasing in the future, but not by that much. If we look at the maximum wind speed within the storm, it will also be increasing, comparing the red with the blue, but also not by that much. But in terms of the area, the size of the storm, this is where we see a huge difference in the future. The storms will become more intense, but not necessarily like so much more intense in terms of the wind speed, but in terms of the size of the storm, it would be much larger, and therefore the area affected by the storm uprooting the trees will become much larger. So this is also again something of concern. So now I'm summarizing what I have discussed. So the key messages, I would like to say that climate change increases both the thermal energy and the latent energy, and both of these type of energies feed into extreme weather event, which is why we expect extreme weather event to be increasing in the future in general. And I introduced a quantity called theta E, which is what we call the surface equivalent potential temperature. It represents both the thermal and latent energy. I would argue that this term or this quantity is much more important compared to the temperature itself to be used when we try to set a warming target. Like for example, should how should we be mitigating climate change? Should we try to keep global warming to within 2 degrees Celsius or within 4 degrees Celsius? It's actually not as meaningful as if we try to set the warming targets based on theta E, because theta E correlates much better with extreme temperature, right? So there are stronger relationship between extreme weather and theta E compared to T. So theta E should be used to set our warming targets in the future. Number two, theta E increases non-linearly. There is really an urgency because you might think that temperature increase linearly, so we have time. We have time to set this warming target. But actually, theta E increases non-linearly. So if we wanted to keep extreme weather to be within certain amount of increase, we need to really use this quantity, and we need to urgently cap the global warming. And lastly, I gave you some examples of regional changes in extreme weather. We have now modeling tools that we can use quite advanced. We can really look at how climate change may be altering extreme events such as hurricanes, thunderstorms, wildfires. All of these could be quite well actually simulated by climate models, allowing us to look at their future changes. But I also wanted to really also highlight that when we think about extreme weather, we usually think about it locally, right? So, oh, the extreme weather, we have a thunderstorm now affecting my area. But actually, the changes in the extreme weather and their impacts are often connected to processes that happen far away. I have shown you, for example, that the warmer sea surface temperature over the tropical Pacific Ocean can increase the heat dome over the northwest or the northwest region, and then the same warming can be affecting the chance of hurricanes making landfall, and changes in the wildfires in the Canadian boreal forest could affect smokes over the eastern United States. So sometimes these changes are really non-trivial, which means that it does require using models and analysis to really better comprehend why we might be seeing certain changes in the future. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm glad that we have about maybe 10 minutes if there are any questions for me.
Excellent talk, Ruby. Thanks very much for taking the time with us
Thank
today.
you.
We really appreciate that, and really good talk. It was pretty interesting stuff. Lots of interesting changes going on. So I think let me see if there are some questions.
Should I maybe stop sharing? Then we can see all the.
Yeah, sure. It's up to you.
Okay.
It's fine.
All right.
It's a nice background screen you have too.
So this is the project that has been funding a lot of the work that I presented. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, it sounds really good. So I guess I have a question that's very similar to one that's actually asked online. So theta E, when you talk about latent energy, I guess for those who are sort of unfamiliar with the, what latent energy is, it's sort of unrealized energy, right? So it has to be released for us to realize that energy. So that is it's released in the form of thunderstorms and precipitation systems in general. So I think it's just important to point that
Yeah.
out. And
So yeah, so maybe I can explain that a little bit further because so latent energy, as you said, it has to be realized, right? So when you have water, when water evaporate into water vapor, then it takes away some energy. It takes some energy in order to evaporate. So that's what this latent energy is. At the same time, if you have water vapor that condense to form clouds, that condensation release the latent energy. So indeed, it does require conversion from one form of water to another form of water.
right, yeah. Yeah, you need the phase change to happen, right? Yeah. Okay, I don't see other ones on there. There's a couple here, I guess in this chat. So one from Trevor. Thanks for the great talk as always, Ruby. Could you comment on whether theta E is relevant to regional climate risk assessments as well as to global climate policy?
Definitely, yes, I would think so. Not only that theta E is relevant for setting global warming level or targets, but theta E, as I shown, for example, I show a spatial map of the correlation between theta E with the convective available potential energy, and we see this positive correlation almost everywhere, right? So which means that even regionally, if you use theta E to look at like, how much energy might be available for convection or convective storms to develop, that's also very relevant. So definitely, yeah, theta E is an important quantity, not only globally, but also for regional changes as well.
Oh, very good. Another question, in the meteorological and climate field, is there a topic on which researchers should spend more time on? Or is there a topic that might become more important in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely extreme events would be a very important topic that we need to continue to work on, even though I have shown quite a few examples of studies that we have performed, and also as definitely many other researchers have also looked into extreme events. But after all, extreme events are quite difficult to look at. So there are some general principle, like for example, looking at the energy available for extreme events to happen. But different kinds of extreme events are also rather different. So looking at wildfires, for example, what factors would be driving changes, future changes in wildfires are not identical to just like looking at how drought or flooding might be changing. So I think these extreme events and how they would change would be very important. So as I mentioned, now we have more tools to use to look at extreme events, but those tools are very computationally expensive. I've shown some very high resolution simulation of storms and things like that. I think there's a lot of room for further improving the tools, research tools that we have, as well as using a variety of tools to help us better understand and project future changes.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Yeah, there was another comment or another question that sort of related to what I was thinking about too. So you're looking at surface theta E, but have you looked at it in the vertical? I guess so. So one of the comments was moisture, unlike greenhouse gas, is not well mixed throughout the atmosphere. Have you taken this into account when looking into correlations with theta E? So I guess it's the vertical distribution of theta E that might be important too.
Yeah, this is a very good question. For that particular study, we didn't really look into the vertical structure of theta E, but I agree that it would be very interesting to actually look at that because um, the vertical structure itself is actually quite important for looking at convection, right? So it's not just the surface, the theta E at the surface that would be providing the energy. So as a matter of fact, because as I said, moisture near the surface over land in particular could actually be decreasing. So overall, under global warming, we expect moisture to increase partly because the ocean has unlimited moisture amount. So there's a lot of increase in the evaporation coming from the ocean, and a lot of the moisture over land comes from the ocean by advection, right? But if you are looking at much further inland, not near the coastal region and things like that, actually land can become drier because you lack the source of moisture, but the temperature keep increasing. And so actually, relatively, then it becomes even drier and the vapor pressure deficit increases. And so actually this potentially can inhibit convection. So the combination of convection inhibition and the increase in the moisture that fuel the convection, the two combined together could be very important to look into. So yeah, I think that's a very good question.
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of goes along with we've done some work looking at future hailstorms and others as well, looking at future convection, and they're finding that the SIN, so that the convective inhibition is actually getting stronger with climate change, just because, and we found that the big reason for that is the temperatures, the air temperatures are outpacing the dew point temperatures. So you get a bigger dew point spread, which makes the relative humidity larger, so it increases your convective inhibition.
Yeah, so to me, I think an important question is whether ultimately the intensity of the convective storms, is it more controlled by the inhibition or controlled by the CAPE, right? Because we know that inhibition can actually trap the moisture because it inhibit convection to be easily happening. Then it actually, in a way, it's actually trapping the moisture. And after trapping the moisture for a while, if there's still more moisture to have, then it can produce a very explosive storm. So I am always interested to see like how ultimately the intensity of a convective storm, is it more controlled by the SIN or is it more controlled by the CAPE? And based on the simulation that I show where we look at the score line over the Amazon, in fact, we see that the ultimate intensity of that score line seems to be more controlled by the SIN under global warming. There's an increase in the inhibition, seems to be more controlled by the increase in the inhibition than the change in the CAPE. But this might be an isolated example. So I think this is an important topic to continue to delve into.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of these MCS systems are nocturnal too, so there's lots of weird things that happen overnight.
Yeah.
You get the boundary layers decoupled from the free troposphere, so there's lots of other things going on too. So
Mm-hmm.
so I'll just get to a couple of questions, I guess, before we end here. We only have a couple more minutes. I was wondering if you expect future changes that you found for the study derecho event to apply for derechos. Let me hang on to that let me read this. It's a long question. So do you expect the surface aridity to apply elsewhere for derechos? So do you think, I guess, is the effect of aridity going to affect derechos? And I mean, have you actually looked at some case studies to see if something is in there?
Yeah. So in my presentation, I only show one example, which is the 2012 North American derecho. So we simulated that derecho as it happened in the past, and then we do this so-called storyline simulation. We increase the temperature, we add some perturbation corresponding to how we expect climate to change in the future, and then we simulate the same derecho again. So that's the result I show. But interestingly, so later on, we also perform same kind of simulations for like a dozen of different derechos that happened in the past to see are there any general trend like, oh, derecho all becomes smaller or something like that. We find very diverse results. And so we haven't completely finished analyzing those simulations to see whether there might be some principle like why these few derechos under global warming would strengthen and these few would weaken. I think this is still a very much research in progress.
Yeah, yeah, certainly, yeah. Okay, so yeah, we're almost 6 hours. So we'll try for one more here. There's several others, but I don't want to go too much over time. Can you comment on possible uncertainty in heat dome frequency projections, given that observations are suggesting a cooling trend in the tropical East Pacific in contrast with model projections?
Yeah, very, very good question. So based on the results that we analyzed from CMIP6 simulations, we see very robust results. So that projection of the increase in the heat dome over northwestern North America is very robust. But that is because in CMIP6 models, now most of the climate models project a larger warming over the tropical Eastern Pacific, the so-called El Nino-like warming pattern. Whereas in CMIP5, actually half of the model says that the Eastern Pacific would warm more than the Central Pacific, and the other half of the model says the other way around. So I think this is still very much a question that the community needs to further understand. Like, should we expect the tropical Eastern Pacific, the El Nino-like warming to be dominating in the future, while we actually observe cooling in that region in the last few decades. But more and more, I think there have been studies suggesting that the discrepancy between what we observe in the last few decades, which is cooling over that region, compared to climate models projecting that that region will be warming in the future. In fact, a lot of it is due to natural variability. But the word is still out there.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so I think it's just beyond 6 o'clock. I don't think it's fair to keep Ruby on here for too much longer. She has some traveling to do. I think tomorrow she's on her way to Boulder. So, but there's a number of questions still to go. So I apologize to those who were unable to address the questions, but hopefully we covered at least some of the major
Feel
ones.
feel free to send me email if you do want to follow up. Yeah, I don't mind addressing any other questions if you send me an email.
Well, that's kind of you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure some people will take
All
you up
right.
on that. Well, thanks again, Ruby. We really appreciate your time to take away from us or time with us today, and we appreciate your talk. Very interesting. So thank you again from on behalf of all the CMOS community here.
Thank you very much, for having me. Okay,
Have a
bye.
good night.